Welcome back to Alcove and part 2 of the Mummy franchise series. This time we've watched the Hammer series. This series does well at capturing the horror feel of the original series while successfully building its own stories with the exception of the first movie. The first in the Hammer series is a reboot rather than an original take like the others. It reuses characters and a lot of the plot points with some changes from the original series. Following the first release, each movie in the series is entirely unrelated to each other, with a new mummy, a new cast, new characters, and new threats. It's a good mummy series, but a better independent series. And with that very brief intro, let's jump into my thoughts on each of these movies. First up, we have the 1959 The Mummy. The film opens up with a classic depiction of an English archaeological expedition. The focus is in the search for the tomb of Ananka, your first sign that this series will be very closely attempting to assimilate as many details from the prior series as possible. As expected, the explorers dismiss the warnings of the local villagers who fear the wrath of the ancient tomb. Before the party opens the tomb, our priest shows up and tells them he who robs the graves of Egypt dies. This obviously foreshadowing exactly what will happen and the impending doom that will unfold. I felt the set design in the film is notably more intricate and detailed compared to its predecessors. The attention to atmosphere enhances the cinematography and acting far better than what we had in the Universal Classic Monsters series. This is immediately obvious at the onset of the film just by observing the camp, but made even more obvious once we enter Ananka's tomb. We see much more attention given to the details of the background and the various relics that are given momentary opportunities to shine on screen. A 6-month time jump follows the opening of the tomb. We find Steve Manning suffering from the aftermath of a stroke, and the archaeological team has just finished looting the tomb. And without explanation ever being given, they choose to destroy it by blowing it up. This decision adds a sense of recklessness, and to me, kind of helps justify the consequences that follow. We're pretty quickly introduced to the mummy, Karis, once again, but in this installment, the creators have abandoned the use of tana leaves for the resurrection ritual, opting instead for the Scroll of Life as a method to revive the mummy. Christopher Lee takes on the role of Karis, and his portrayal is notably different. While still stiff and methodical in movement, Lee's mummy is granted a wider range of motion, which makes him a more credible and terrifying threat. Unlike previous versions, Karis is more focused and precise in his actions. After killing the second Banning, he forgoes the opportunity to kill another target. Instead, he leaves abruptly. This choice suggests a more singular, driven purpose in his missions, while also reinforcing his existence as merely a tool or a weapon once again. The film places a greater emphasis on the backstory of both Ananka and Karis. We learn more about her death, the elaborate funeral rites, and her eventual burial alongside Karis. I believe that this extended backstory helps drive interest in the characters, and while it takes place in the middle of the movie, something that might detract from the flow of the story, I think it's best placed here. One of the film's standout features is its use of tension and drama. The dialogue between characters is sharp and well crafted, but easily approachable, and the sets are well designed and utilized to enhance the on-screen action. The growing dread is evident as the characters face mounting threats, and I believe this film to be an excellent reboot that incorporates much of the details from the prior movies. Our second film in the Hammer series is The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, which released in 1964. We're treated to an opening sequence of a tomb. This might be the most intricate set yet, with so many statues and relics. This scene helps set the tone as it pans from over those items. That tone is only further set in the next scene, where we are introduced to a group of horse riders who ride up and nearly silently kill and dehand an archaeologist who had been tied to poles sticking out of the sand. There's a common theme of irreverence to the dead throughout these films that seems to be a high point in this film. Aside from the continued tradition of ignoring the superstitious threats from opening the tomb and disturbing the remains, we have at the start some workers carrying in the body of the dead archaeologist, and they drop his body on a stretcher deliberately in front of his daughter. And then we have the financier of the expedition who wants to parade the mummy around the world to make more money than what the museum is willing to pay for it. This iteration is far less serious in tone and atmosphere than the others, and feels more like somewhere between the later movies of the Universal Classic Monsters and the Abbott and Costello version, but very much without any slapstick comedy. This movie is somewhat lighter and has some minor attempts at humor. At one point, an attempt at a humorous scene that reinforces my point of irreverence you have some workers mockingly playing with a relic, likening a jackal headpiece to their wife. The cinematography choices of lingering on something of some unimportance, such as the throwaway relic, or a dancer at the restaurant after the characters left, and so on, feels distinctly like what I know of similar movies from the 60s. It feels simultaneously like wasted time, yet in some ways it helps make the world feel more alive, reminding you that people and places exist beyond the characters. Something that damages this movie is that a lot of the male characters are almost indistinguishable from one another. It's almost hard to keep track of who is who, and you never really have a reason to get attached to any of the characters. With most deaths, I had to ask myself who that even was, and did I need to care? It's hard to even determine which characters were present for the opening of the tomb, as the movie starts after this event. I believe that this is something that sabotages the attempts at suspense building. You don't know who's likely to be targeted. In these films, that's something that's needed. About 40 minutes into the film, we finally get a scene where the financier explains the opening of the tomb, who the core members of the expedition are, and shows the tomb being opened. This is where the movie should have started, or at least be the scene immediately following the archaeologist being murdered. The scene does so much of the heavy lifting in terms of setting up the story, it makes no sense to be shown so late in the movie. The threat of danger is supposed to be the mummy's curse, but about half of the movie, it's other people that pose the real danger and are exacting revenge for opening the tomb. However, when the mummy does reveal itself, it makes quick successive work in killing some of the members of the expedition. I will give credit that the showmanship in this movie is certainly one of its strong points, such as with the pageantry of the reporters and with the reveal of the mummy in the alley before its first killing. It adds to the drama of the movie. This is the first movie that breaks the tradition of the Egyptian character not being behind the control of the mummy. It's a change that I appreciated as a fan of the franchise. And as for the big twist at the end, out of nowhere and without any hints or reason for suspicion, one of the British men is revealed to be the brother of the mummy and cursed with eternal life. It truly made no sense and should not have been part of this movie. I feel like the entire ending was out of place with the rest of the film. Ultimately, I just feel like it was poorly written. It's a shame because this film had a chance to break away from the formula and do something special, but it fumbled it so often that it was just a bit of a disappointment. 3 years later, in 1967, The Mummy Shroud was released. We once again intro with the story of the man who becomes the mummy, a slave to the boy pharaoh whose tomb is desecrated by the archaeologists. There's a lot more action in this intro than we've seen before. There's a big battle between competing factions, and the boy pharaoh must escape into the desert with his loyalists. It's a striking change from the limited and short burst action that we've come to expect from the mummy backgrounds. The atmosphere of this movie has certainly drifted further toward adventure than primarily relying on the traditionally expected horror aspect. While the set design is somewhat more plain than the prior movie, I don't think it detracts from the story at all. The murders of the expedition did somewhat bring the horror aspect back with more gruesome murders, including that either could have been a strangulation or a breaking of the main archaeologist's skull, then using photo acid to kill another, and then finally throwing another member out through a window. For once, one of the characters actually voices some hesitancy at the sight of the tomb. The language expert Barbara Preston speaks out against reading the words on the child pharaoh's shroud. These words on the shroud are the method of revitalization of the mummy in this movie. The financier of the expedition this time, Stanley, might have been the true villain of the story, though, and I realized from the very beginning that I was hoping for his demise. He's an easy character to dislike, which meant you found yourself rooting for the mummy more often than feeling tension in the hopes of the tomb's opener surviving. I mean, he's even willing to abandon his son and to find his own way home out of Cairo when the threat of the mummy continues to grow. The mummy seems to have the most natural movements yet in the franchise. It also seems to have the most memory or connection with its mortal life, as evidenced when he first comes back and he stands in front of the pharaoh's body. I'll also give the film the accolade that I believe the mummy to be the most visually horrifying yet in this film. I think the costume department really excelled in this movie in general, but the mummy is genuinely scary to look at, especially given the scenes where it's on the assault. I also enjoy that this movie brought back the apparent organized guardians of the tomb. The temple guardian warned them when they entered the tomb, and then he left. Later, he brought back the mummy by reading the words on the shroud, but he never directly participated in any of the killings. Then there's the Guardian's mother, who's a fortune teller, who helps the son with the use of her crystal ball to keep track of the expedition members. And finally, we get to see a great conclusion with the destruction of the mummy when Barbara uses the Shroud to speak the words that ends the mummy's continued existence, saving herself and the only other surviving member. The final component to this film that I would like to praise is the use of non-English, something that should have been implemented all along given the relation to Egyptian mythology. And now we have Blood from the Mummy's Tomb in 1971. This is the final movie in the series, and we're introduced to the movie with some rather unnecessary near nudity and a silent ritual. The woman appears to be sacrificed and her hand is fed to some wild jackals, who then die and we see the hand crawling away. The participants in the ritual are all killed by wind as they leave the cave. There's no mummy in this movie, and instead the threat comes in the form of possession. Our female lead, Margaret, is possessed by the Egyptian queen, who we saw at the beginning of the film after her body is brought to London. Really, the only connection between this movie and what we know of the Mummy franchise up to this point is that we are dealing with a long-dead Egyptian whose tomb has been desecrated. And this particular movie is actually based on a book titled The Jewel of the Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. Rather than the traditional and expected horror genre, this movie falls under the psychological suspense. This movie takes place in the 1970s, and pretty much from the outset, we have several scenes where seven stars are seen in various places, including the ring that Barbara has that previously belonged to the Queen, and a coat, and a crystal ball. We're pretty much immediately thrown into the strange happenings. We've got prophetic dreams, dads nearly dying from an unknown cause, near heart attacks at the sight of Barbara, and much more. The expedition that unearthed the tomb has already happened before we've jumped to the 70s, but we are still given the scene of the tomb being opened with the Queen giving some exposition. Those who opened the Queen's tomb were somehow guided there by her, and we learned that they are supposed to each take one of her relics. Each of the expedition members and artifacts are given close-up shots to finally help establish who and what's important, something that can be appreciated after some of the previous movies. As the movie progresses, there are a few scenes where it becomes increasingly suspicious as to who is in control of Barbara's body. This was great for building suspense and kept me wondering if this was really possession or if the Queen's soul was just corrupting or merging with Barbara's. Between the uncertainty of Barbara, the intermittent scenes at the psychiatric hospital where we are exposed to cruelty and violence, and the mystery behind the various characters' motives and the use of psychological suspense, it's actually very well built throughout the movie. To top it all off on the suspense, we have no idea if the lone survivor in bandages in the hospital at the end of the movie is Barbara or the Queen. The movie was less predictable than previous entries in the series, and it's something that I can appreciate. However, I don't think that this movie should be considered part of the Mummy franchise. I'm not at all opposed to the formula being broken by movies in a franchise or with reboots. But this movie represents such a significant departure from any other movie in the franchise in terms of story, villain, and methodology. It's the only one to do so to this degree. It's a great attempt to be different, but I feel compelled to say it's just not a mummy movie without a mummy. Thank you so much for checking out part 2 of the Mummy franchise series. I have been absolutely enjoying getting to watch all these movies and being critical. Part 3 will be on the Stephen Sommers series. This series will be looking at The Mummy from 1999 with Brendan Fraser. Then we have The Mummy Returns 2001 and The Tomb of the Dragon Emperor from 2008. That is the Stephen Sommers series. We also have the animated series that ran from 2001 to 2003. However, we're only going to be reviewing the Mummy movies rather than the TV show. This is especially just given the limited amount of time we have. However, in part 3, we'll also be covering the Dark Universe, The Mummy from 2017. That's the Tom Cruise attempted reboot at the series. Following this, I believe we will be doing a part 4, where we're going to do some general discussion about the series as a whole, as well as looking at some of the other spin-off materials. Like I said previously, there's the animated series. There's also numerous video games, comic books, and so on. So we're going to just broadly look at some of those materials and give it a nice little end cap to this series. So thanks for joining this time, and I hope you'll come back next time.